The radio and select box component present a set of values on a form the end user can choose from. Traditionally, these components are configured with static values, meaning the values have to manually be changed within the component settings whenever new values are to be added or updated. In this video, we will demonstrate the process of setting up a select box and radio component to retrieve dynamic values from an external source, specifically a Form.IO resource. This functionality enables the form builder to effortlessly update numerous radio or select box components across various forms embedded within your application by simply modifying the data source connected to these components. This example will utilize two different forms, an employee information form and a job application form. The employee information form contains a radio component with different contact value options. Similarly, the job application form contains a select box component with the same type of values. Keeping the use case in mind, imagine that these components are not limited to just two forms, but are utilized in a multitude of forms embedded within your application. With this static value configuration, the form builder must manually update the values for each component incorporated into the form. Manually updating these values present the potential for the form builder to make a mistake while updating the values. This could cause issues for workflows such as server-side logic or specific database configurations that rely on specific IDs or value names from the components. Utilizing a dynamic data source alleviates these potential issues and ensures a quick update while maintaining component value continuity across all of the forms these components are saved to. So let's go back to our Form.IO project to configure these components for dynamic values. As mentioned, we are going to use a Form.IO resource as our data source. So we first need to create our resource that will hold our values. I'm going to create a new resource called contact method and add a text field called contact method, which will be used to save our contact method values. And we're going to use the resource and make 3 submissions. Later on in this video, we're going to go back and update these values. So we now have home phone, email, and fax. With our submissions in place, I now need to grab the submission endpoint for the resource, which will be used as our data source URL. So I'm going to go to this More Settings button and click Form API and copy this submission endpoint. The next thing I'm going to do is click the Access tab for my resource, and I'm going to check the Everyone role for the Read All submission. This will ensure that anybody can read the submission data of my resource when the resource data is being viewed externally from the radio and select box components within our application. So now let's go back to our forms, and I'm gonna go to the employee record form, and I'm gonna edit my contact method radio component. I'm gonna click the Data tab, and as we can see here, the data source type is set to values, which is the static value method. So I'm gonna remove these values and select URL for my data source type. I'm going to paste my submission endpoint from my resource. Next, we need to modify the item template, which tells the component what part of the data object the radio component should use for the values. The API property name of the field will be used to reference the data. So this is going to be the API endpoint property name for the contact method field within my resource. So I can see here that I have home phone, email, and fax set for my radio component values. Again, this contact method is the property name. So if I go back to my resource and edit my contact method field and go to the API tab, this is the property name I am referring to. All right, we're going to go to our job application form and do the same thing for the SelectBox contact method component. Go to the data tab, remove our static values, switch our data source type to URL. We're going to paste the contact method submission endpoint, modify our item template. Again, this will be the property name of the contact method field within the resource. And we will save our form. Now if we go back to our application form within our app and refresh, the component values are going to be the same. However, the values are no longer set statically, but instead pulled in dynamically from our resource. So let's go back to our original use case and pretend instead of these 2 forms here, we have 50 forms with these components saved to. And as the form builder, we are tasked with removing a value, modifying a value, and adding a value to these contact method components. Again, if we were going to do it manually, not only would it take a lot of time, but we could potentially make a mistake, causing issues with things like server-side validation or logic or something of the sort. Instead of having to update these manually, instead we can go directly to our data source. So I'm going to go to our contact method resource, go to the data tab, and we're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to modify our home phone value. We're going to change that to cell phone. We're going to delete the fax value since that's no longer relevant. And we're going to use the resource and add a new contact method value, and we'll do something like text message. So now we have cell phone, email, and text message as our contact method values. So if I go back to my application, do a refresh, we can see the new values being pulled in dynamically. Same thing for our other form. Cell phone, email, and text message. So it saves a lot of time, and it ensures that all the values are identical across any number of forms these components might be saved to. So obviously we are using a resource as our data source. I would like to mention that you can use other data source types, or endpoints I should say. So here I have an API endpoint of JSON values of US states. So I'm going to go back to my job application form, and I'm just going to show you an example of pulling in these values from another source. Call this US states. So I'm pasting my API endpoint for those US states. For the item template here, I'm going to use this name identifier within the JSON object. And if we refresh our application, we can see our US state values populated within our form. So that's how you configure radio components and SelectBox components for dynamic values. Thank you for watching.